On June 29, 1995, thousands of people walked into a shopping mall in Seoul, South Korea, and almost none of them walked back out. Families were there. Couples. Office workers who had stopped in on the way home. Children with their faces pressed against glass display cases, pointing at things they wanted their parents to see. Nobody said goodbye that morning. Why would they? They were going shopping. But hidden above those bright lights and polished floors, buried inside concrete walls that looked completely solid, something had been quietly breaking apart for years. And on that Thursday evening, it finally ran out of time. What happened next lasted less than 20 seconds. But here's what made it different from every other structural disaster in modern history. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a natural disaster. And it wasn't a surprise. Not to everyone. June 29, 1995. 5 o'clock in the evening. Seoul. Midsummer. The kind of heat that follows you indoors. Inside Sampoong Department Store, the air conditioning hummed steadily. Soft music drifted through every floor. The smell of grilled meat and rice drifted down the hallways from the restaurants on the upper level, where the dinner crowd was just beginning to settle in. Escalators carried shoppers between floors without stopping. Display cases caught the light. Somewhere near the children's section, a little girl laughed at something. The kind of bright, sudden laugh that makes everyone nearby smile without knowing why. Nothing was wrong. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. Cashiers scanned purchases. Employees folded and stacked and arranged. Security guards watched the busy entrances the way they had watched them hundreds of times before. And that was exactly it. Hundreds of times before. This building had been full of people like this. Exactly like this. Every single day for years. Why would today be different? But the buildings surrounding all of them had already answered that question. Because beneath those polished floors, inside those clean white walls, something had been happening for a very long time. Something the people shopping on the third floor had no way of knowing. Something the couple sharing food in the restaurant upstairs couldn't have imagined. Something the little girl near the display cases would one day spend the rest of her life trying to forget. To understand what happened that afternoon, you have to understand what Sampoong actually meant to the people of Seoul. This was not just a shopping mall. In the heart of Gangnam, the wealthiest, most modern part of the city, Sampoong wasn't just a store. It was a symbol. Glass walls that caught the light just right. Brand names people recognized and wanted to be seen carrying. Restaurants always full. Floors always crowded. For many families, spending an afternoon at Sampoong wasn't simply an errand. It was an experience. A place you brought your children on weekends. Where young couples walked slowly between floors with nowhere particular to be. Where office workers stopped after long days because the building felt like a reward for getting through another week. Nobody questioned the floors they were walking on. Nobody thought about the ceiling above their heads. Because when a building looks like that, when every surface is clean and every employee is smiling and the escalators are running smoothly, your brain makes a decision before you're even aware of it. Safe. This place is safe. And that trust, quiet and automatic, was the most invisible thing inside Sampoong Department Store. To understand why Sampoong collapsed, you have to go back to before it ever opened. Before the first escalator was installed. Before the restaurants were fitted out. Before a single customer ever crossed that threshold. Because what happened on June 29, 1995, wasn't decided that day. It was decided years earlier, inside a planning office, by a man who wanted more.
On paper, this was supposed to be an office building. Simple, predictable, built to hold desks, chairs, people walking to meetings, nothing more. But Lee Jun, the chairman of the Sampoong Group, looked at those blueprints and saw a missed opportunity. Offices don't pull in crowds. A department store does. And crowds mean money. So he picked up the phone. Change it. And just like that, A building meant to carry the weight of office furniture was redrawn into 5 floors of marble counters, designer racks, and restaurants built to seat hundreds at a time. All of it heavier. All of it pressing down on a foundation that had never been asked to hold any of it. That should have been the end of the changes. It wasn't. Walls came down to open up floor space. Support columns, the bones of the building, were shifted out of place or cut away completely because they were standing where a display case wanted to go. And then came the rooftop air conditioners. Units so heavy they weighed in the hundreds of tons, dragged across the roof again and again as Sampoong's owners kept changing their minds about where they should sit. Every drag sent a shudder down through the concrete, down through columns that were already carrying more than they were ever built for. Engineers would later call this single decision one of the most dangerous of all. At the time, nobody above the 5th floor felt a thing. The company that Lee Jun had originally hired to handle these changes refused. They warned him directly. These modifications were dangerous. He fired them and found a contractor who would do it anyway. So the building that eventually opened its doors, the building that Seoul's residents came to love and trust, was not the building that had been designed and approved. It was something else entirely. A structure built on compromises, each one invisible, each one load-bearing, each one waiting. The week before June 29th, something changed inside Sampoong. Not dramatically, not all at once. Quietly. The way things break when they've been breaking for a long time. Employees working on the upper floors began noticing cracks, thin lines spreading across the ceiling of the 5th floor, growing slightly wider each day. Some of the doors no longer closed properly. The floor felt different underfoot in certain areas, subtly wrong, the way a step feels when the board beneath it has started to give. Then came the sounds, low, deep, rhythmic almost, like something heavy settling under impossible pressure. Workers who had spent years inside the building heard it and understood instinctively that they had never heard anything like it before. They reported it, not once, repeatedly. And on the morning of June 29th, management made a decision. They called in engineers to inspect the 5th floor. What those engineers found should have ended the day right there. The ceiling above the 5th floor was sagging, not cracking, sagging, bowing downward like a held breath about to give out. The columns holding it up were buckling under a weight they were never meant to carry. In plain terms, the top of this building was failing, right now, with thousands of people still standing underneath it. Their recommendation was immediate and unambiguous. Evacuate the building. Everyone. All 5 floors. Every customer, every employee. Right now. Management gathered to discuss it. The store was full. It was a Thursday evening, one of the busiest trading periods of the week. Closing the building would mean turning away thousands of customers. It would mean lost revenue. It would mean questions. And so they made a different decision. They closed the 5th floor only. Just the 5th floor. The restaurants, the shopping levels below. The thousands of people who had no idea this conversation was even happening. They stayed. Music kept playing through the speakers. The cash registers kept running. And the building, already past the point of recovery, kept counting down. At 5:52 in the evening, the counting stopped. A sound moved through the building. Not a crack exactly, something lower, more final. The kind of sound that exists below the range of explanation. Everything stopped. Mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-reach for something on a shelf. Shoppers on the 3rd floor looked at the person next to them. Employees looked toward the ceiling. A cashier on the second floor set down the item she was scanning. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then the ceiling fell. Not one section, all of it. The fifth floor collapsed downward into the fourth into the third into the second. Each floor carrying the weight of everything above it, falling faster than the human mind could track. A chain reaction that took a 5-story building and compressed it into rubble in less time than it takes to read this sentence. Escalators buckled and twisted apart. Glass exploded across every corridor. The lights vanished inside clouds of dust so dense that daylight disappeared in an instant. Not dimmed, just gone. Replaced by a grey, suffocating dark that swallowed everything. The music stopped mid-note. People were running. Some made it to exits. Some turned toward where they thought an exit was and found nothing. Some were already buried before they understood what was happening. In less than 20 seconds, a building that had stood for years, a building that thousands of people had walked through that very morning, that very hour, was gone. Where light had been, there was darkness. Where sound had been, there was dust. And then, settling over all of it, silence. But not complete silence. Beneath thousands of tons of broken concrete, someone was knocking. Faint, slow, but rhythmic, deliberate, alive. For the people trapped inside the ruins, everything had collapsed at once. The building, time, direction, certainty. There was no light. The air was thick with concrete dust. Many couldn't move at all, pinned in place, unable to tell whether the pain they felt meant they were badly hurt or just still in shock. Some didn't know which way was up. Others called out, not words, just sound, needing to hear something come back. And sometimes something did. A voice from somewhere in the dark. A hand reaching through a gap in the rubble and finding another hand. Complete strangers speaking softly to each other through concrete walls, telling each other to hold on. Above the ruins, the city mobilized. Police, firefighters, military units, civilian volunteers who had heard the news and come running with bare hands. Emergency barriers went up around the site to hold back the crowds already gathering. Hundreds of people holding photographs, showing them to anyone in a uniform, asking the same questions. Have you seen her? Did a woman come out from that side? Is there a children's section? Where would the children have been? Rescue teams moved through the rubble with extraordinary care. One wrong pull, one miscalculated shift in the debris, and unstable sections could drop again, directly onto survivors already pinned in the dark below. Every decision mattered. Every moment mattered. The first night came. Experts reminded the public, gently and painfully, that survival odds dropped significantly with every hour. Without water, without medical attention, the body has limits that don't negotiate. But then, in the early hours of the morning, when the machinery had stopped and the site had gone briefly, deliberately quiet, rescuers heard it again. Knocking. Faint. Slow. Real. And the search continued. Days passed. Not hours. Days. By the time 2 weeks had gone by, most of the families still waiting outside had been quietly, devastatingly redirected. Toward hospital lists, toward identification processes, toward the unbearable work of accepting what the rescue workers could not say out loud. The operation had shifted from rescue to recovery. And then, on July 15th, 16 days after the collapse, rescue workers deep inside the rubble heard something they had stopped expecting to hear. A voice. Park Sung-hyun, a 19-year-old salesperson, had survived for 16 days trapped inside a collapsed department store. No food, almost no water. Alone in the dark, in a space barely large enough to exist in, she had stayed alive by staying still and staying awake and holding on to the single decision she kept making every hour. Not yet. When she emerged, covered in dust, barely able to stand, blinking against daylight she hadn't seen in over 2 weeks, the crowd behind the barriers erupted. Rescue workers who had been working in silence for days held each other. Some of them wept. It wasn't just one life. It was every reason they had refused to stop looking. But for every Park Sung-hyun, there were 501 others. In total, 502 people died in the collapse of Sampoong Department Store. More than 900 were injured. Entire families were permanently altered by an afternoon that had begun like every other afternoon. Unremarkable, safe, completely ordinary.
502 people never made it home that evening. They had no idea a decision had already been made. Nobody told them. That's what makes Sampoong more than a tragedy. It was a choice, made by someone else, paid for by 502 people who trusted the wrong building. They went to a shopping mall. They never came home. And the people who knew left the doors open.